Looking to put a bow on their offseason program, the Seahawks will host their annual mandatory minicamp at the VMAX starting on Tuesday. What should fans be looking for on offense and defense? I'm going to be previewing the first minicamp under Mike Macdonald coming up here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s that are tuning in as always, whether you're listening in from Syracuse, Indiana, or overseas in Brussels. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. I'm hosting this show from the beach here on the coast in Washington. So a little bit of a vacation. This is kind of my break here before we hit the road for mandatory minicamp tomorrow. Speaking of mandatory minicamp, going to be diving into all the key storylines that fans should be looking for heading into these final 3 days of the offseason program before the Seahawks head out for a long break prior to training camp. Also going to be tackling your questions in our Monday mailbag segment as well. This episode brought your way by our friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Now for your lead story here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Seattle just wrapped up their first set of OTAs under new coach Mike Macdonald last Friday. All 10 of those practices in the books. And they're going to be looking to wrap up their first offseason program with a new coaching staff on a strong note this week. They've got their annual 3-day mandatory minicamp and got to make sure to include the word mandatory in there because OTAs, the rest of the offseason program, those are all voluntary according to the collective bargaining agreement. That is not the case when we're talking about mandatory minicamp. However, veterans at least have to be in attendance. Now, some teams handled this thing a little bit differently. We saw under Pete Carroll, there were times veterans showed up and they were in attendance. They had a jersey on, but really didn't do anything. So we'll see what that means for players like Draymond Jones, who have not been in attendance at OTAs to this point. I would anticipate that he is going to be there tomorrow. Nonetheless, these 3 days are crucial because this is the last on-field work the Seahawks are going to be getting for over 6 weeks until they report for the first training camp under Mike Macdonald. So what am I going to be looking for these 3 days? Obviously, these are non-contact OTA-style practices, so we're not going to suddenly see the pads come out here the next 3 days, but these are still really important practices. The first thing that I'm going to be watching on the offensive side of the football, it all goes back to the quarterback position. Now, I will say this. Anyone that was hoping to see a competition between Geno Smith and Sam Howell, that is not going to be happening. It's already been evident to this point that what John Schneider and Mike Macdonald said, declaring Geno Smith the starter, that's the way things are. And quite frankly, seeing how they've been in the field, this is not a shot at Sam Howell. I don't think Sam Howell has looked bad out on the practice field. In fact, the second OTA I was at, he looked a lot better than the first one. He's trying to get used to new receivers. He's got a new system he's trying to get adapted to. Geno Smith already has the built-in rapport with all these returning receivers like DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba. So he's got that advantage there. He's been a Pro Bowler the last 2 seasons. He just looks like the superior quarterback in every way. So I want to see how these quarterbacks look as they continue to get Ryan Grubb's offense and they continue to install more concepts. How do those players grow? And of course, there's a newcomer that we get to see this week, officially signed today, PJ Walker joining the Seahawks as their third quarterback. So not only do we get to see Geno Smith and Sam Howell, but we also get to see PJ Walker for the first time as the Seahawks have 3 quarterbacks on the roster. So I want to see the growth in the case of Walker, just how he gets acclimated to this new offense here in his first action this offseason heading towards training camp at the end of July. As far as who's going to be protecting the quarterback, Geno Smith, or if Sam Howell gets to play, the offensive line comes in at number 2 for me as far as things that I'm going to be watching here during this OTA, this mandatory minicamp setting. I want to see the offensive line rotations because up to this point, this has been a position group that's had some injuries. We're not going to see Abraham Lucas out there, at least practicing. He may be in attendance for this mini camp, but Mike Macdonald's already said he's not going to be ready to play till at least the start of training camp. So you're not going to see him. Anthony Bradford's been banged up. He missed all the open OTAs, did not practice, was there, but did not practice. Is he going to be available? And if not, do we see the Seahawks stick with the status quo they've had to this point, where Scott Huff has, instead of putting Christian Haynes, the third-round pick, in with the first-team offense at right guard in place of Anthony Bradford, he's had McLennan Curtis out there, the second-year guard out of Chattanooga. And Curtis is a player that John Schneider was talking up early in the offseason. Maybe he very much is in the mix there, but I'm curious to see at this stage, 3 consecutive days where practices are going to be open to the media. All of this camp is going to be open to the media. I want to see if Christian Haynes starts to get some opportunities there. If Anthony Bradford's back out there, how does that change the complexion of their rotations? Is McLennan Curtis now with the second team, and where does Christian Haynes fit into that? So there's some moving parts there. And then behind George Fant, who has been filling in for Abraham Lucas, he's going to be your right tackle with the ones for right now. If Lucas is not available, then certainly you're going to be talking about George Fant getting the opportunity to start for the Seahawks in week 1. But I want to see what the Seahawks do with Mike Jarrell, because to this point, the 6th rounder out of Findlay, he's been splitting those second-team reps with undrafted rookie Garrett Greenfield. Are we going to start seeing some separation there where the 6th rounder starts to get more opportunities? Or is this going to be a case where the undrafted rookie Greenfield, who, by the way, was a 3-time All-American at the FCS level, maybe he starts pushing that 6th rounder and starts to look like maybe he's the better fit to make this football team? I'm really curious about that. And then at left guard, Satawa Lamea, their 6th-round pick out of Utah, Tremaine Anchor, who they signed in free agency, formerly the Rams, those two competing for snaps as the backup at left guard. We'll see what plays out, but I want to see what those rotations look like. And last but not least, the receiver position. Seattle doesn't have the issues at the top of the depth chart there that they may have an offensive line where they're still figuring some starting spots out. They've got some injuries. You have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith, and Jigba, who's had a fantastic offseason. Those 3, there's no drama. That's your top 3 receivers. But behind those 3, this is an incredibly competitive group. And if there is a position where you really can gain a stronghold on a roster spot this time of year, it's receivers, because these guys still get to run around and catch passes. You get a chance to show what you can do with your route running, your soft hands. These practices, we saw what Jake Bobo did a year ago. I think that he really set the tone for making Seattle's 53-man roster during OTAs and mandatory minicamps, starting to build a rapport with Geno Smith. Can Jake Bobo do it again? He's got to prove himself in front of a totally new coaching staff. To this point, he's gotten a lot of reps of the ones. I don't think he's necessarily in danger of a roster spot, and yet Laviska Shenault coming in, a player that can run the ball, can do damage after the catch, has more solidified numbers as a receiver than what any of the other guys behind the big 3 do on this roster. D. Eskridge, a new coaching staff, hoping they can finally unearth his potential here. This is his last shot in Seattle. And Derek Young, I think he's become kind of a forgotten man that's got some positional flexibility, good size, really good athlete, a great special teams player. You've got 4, maybe even 5 if Hayden Hatton's in the mix here. You've got 4 or 5 receivers that are going to be battling for 2 or 3 positions on this 53-man roster. Kick returns are going to play a big role in this. I don't think we're going to see much on that front until training camp. But as far as the receiver position goes, players such as Eskridge and Young and even Jake Bobo, this is your time to shine. Really solidify your spot on this roster, because this is an uber competitive group. There's going to be some really good players that don't make this 53-man roster for the Seahawks at receiver. So that's a position I feel like you tangibly can see some things during these offseason practices. I'm going to continue to watch there and see, hey, is D. Eskridge able to continue building off some of the things he did earlier at OTAs? Is Derek Young going to show back up? Where does Jake Bobo fit? Laviska Shenault, does that unique skill set he brings to the table, does that help him earn a spot on this football team after signing as a free agent? You've maybe got 2 or 3 spots there. Hayden Hatton might be in the mix too. This is an extremely competitive group that I'm excited to see how things shake out rotation-wise, who makes the big plays and stands out here in the final audition before the start of training camp at the end of July. When I come back, I'm going to be tackling your questions here from our beach house. Going to be answering as many as I can here on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Don't go away. This episode is brought your way by our friends at FanDuel. FanDuel, summertime means baseball, the NBA Finals, and much more, and you can bet on it all on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $200 win or lose. Is Jaylen Brown now the favorite to win NBA Finals MVP? Does Aaron Judge have another home run coming tonight for the New York Yankees? Will Connor McDavid score at least one goal to help the Oilers even up the Stanley Cup? You can bet on it all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and add a big win to your summer bucket list. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s that are listening in. And as always, thanks for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time for our Monday mailbag. Going to be tackling those here from my beach house here, taking a little mini vacation of sorts right before mandatory minicamp here on the coastline. A beautiful day. Nonetheless, tons of questions to tackle from you, the valued listeners of the Locked On Seahawks podcast. So let's get to it. Our first question, and this one coming from Ryan B. Katz on X. What is the play calling situation like at summer practices? Are 11-on-11s kind of like duels between Macdonald and Grubb, or is it more scripted situational stuff? That's a really good question, and I will say this. There has been a lot more 11-on-11 in these OTAs that we've gotten to watch than I remember seeing at any point during the Pete Carroll era, and it makes sense to me for a couple of reasons. For one, you've got two mad scientists here, and going back to the question, I think this does weigh in a little bit. You've got an offensive coordinator in Ryan Grubb who has a history of loving to experiment, moving guys around and mixing in different concepts, being a creative, aggressive play caller. And on defense, you've got a very similar mind in Mike Macdonald, who's cut his teeth in Baltimore with a complex defense that has all kinds of wrinkles they throw at you after the snap. So, of course, these two mad scientists, they're going to be going off of each other, trying to figure out what they can do to best maximize the personnel they have. And at the same time, like any NFL practice, any football practice, there's going to be the emphasis on the situations. And you're seeing that with the red zone drills. They had a OTA that was almost all red zone centric. You've got to get your 3rd and long situations, your 2-minute drills. Those things are all going to continue to happen. So I think this is a blend of things, more so than we've seen in the past with the offensive coordinator and the defensive-minded coach really trying to battle against each other, a battle of wits while they're installing new playbooks. I think that is part of the equation here, and that's part of the reason you're seeing so much 11-on-11, trying to figure out how to best utilize this new personnel, being new coaches on the team. But you're still going to have a lot of situational football that is a big part of the equation here too, because that's just the way that this works when you're coaching football teams. Situations, teams that are really good in situational football, those are the ones that tend to go deep into the playoffs and consistently make the postseason. So that is going to be an emphasis in practice in the NFL no matter what. Next question here, this one coming from Doug B456. Which player do you think would have more trade value in late August, Mike Jackson or Darrell Taylor? I think this is an interesting question from the sense that if you look at the last couple of seasons, those watching, the sun finally has stopped glaring in my eyes so I could take the sunglasses off for a moment here. But when you look at these two players, Mike Jackson has started 21 games the last 2 years and didn't give up a touchdown when he started last year, had a really solid season starting all 17 games 2 years ago. I think from a production standpoint and just visually what you see on film, that Mike Jackson has been the better football player of these two. And yet, with this question, what is valued more? A solid, potentially platoon starting corner like Mike Jackson, or a player like Darrell Taylor, for all the warts he's got defending the run, has a year with 9.5 sacks and consistently has been able to generate fumbles when he gets to the quarterback. This is a league where pass rushers are paid the most. They are prioritized the most, getting after opposing quarterbacks. So from a trade standpoint, and again, some of this bears on what happens with injuries across the league when you're talking training camp, August trades, but I would think Darrell Taylor, the former second-round pick, being a pass rusher, he's probably the player that's going to have the most value to another team in a trade. I can't see Jackson being a guy that's going to fetch much on the open market, but both these guys are at the end of their contracts too, so might not be a huge difference in terms of what you can get in return. I just think a pass rusher, a splashy one at times in Taylor, is going to have more value on the market. Question here coming from Silver Bullet 1859 on X. Which player is more likely to be back in a Seahawks uniform in 2025? Tyler Lockett or Draymond Jones? This is truly one of those wait and see questions. You know, I can take a stab at it here just based on the contracts. If you're just looking at their contract situation right now, Draymond Jones seems more likely just because Tyler Lockett has a ballooning salary cap hit next year. Not that Draymond Jones doesn't have a big one, because his is large too, but the Seahawks, if they're going to bring back Tyler Lockett next year, they're going to have to add another year on his contract. They're going to have to figure out something to lower that cap hit to be able to bring him back at that price tag. Whereas Draymond Jones, maybe there's some mechanisms there in play they can do to lower his cap hit too. But Lockett is the older player. You've got a ascending player in Jackson Smith and Jigba. You've got DK Metcalf already on the roster. Of those two, I would say the one that's on the shakiest ground is probably Lockett, just from a contract standpoint. And you'd love to see him back in 2025, and I think the Seahawks would find a way to do that. But that is a good question, because I think you could have a scenario where either one of those guys is not back next year, depending on how they play this season, the contracts they carry. But I would think, just looking at the contracts, that Lockett is probably the one that's going to be tougher to be able to keep around at that price tag. There's going to have to be some maneuvering there to get him back next season. Good question here coming from Duran Speaks on Threads. Which sophomore Seahawk do you think has the best chance for a leap in year two? So I easily could do the hanging fruit here, because Rob and I have talked about this. Rob will be back on tomorrow's show after the first minicamp practice, and we'll have him here after every single mandatory minicamp practice this week. But as Rob and I have talked about, the low-hanging fruit here would be Devin Witherspoon, because I do think a year two jump from him, as good as he was a year ago, I think he could be much better. I'm not going to go with that low-hanging fruit, though, because I think that generally expectations are former number 5 overall pick is going to make a big leap in year two. I'm going to go with Olu Oluwatimi here. And the big reason why, I don't think there's going to be a competition at center. There's been some people saying, well, Nick Harris, he's played for Scott Huff. Yes, that is true. And maybe there ends up being more of a competition than I'm anticipating. But this feels like it is Olu Oluwatimi's job to lose. I think the Seahawks gave him a chance last year. He started a game, gave him a chance to learn behind Evan Brown. He's got a ton of experience at the center position at the college level. This is a player the Seahawks are very high on, and I can tell you Scott Huff's very high on him. So I think Oluwatimi, in terms of breakout player, a guy that I think can be your starter week one and can start the entire season, health permitting, I think Oluwatimi is that breakout guy in the offensive line from this draft class that has a great opportunity to really show that he can be a long-term part of the Seahawks offensive line. I think Anthony Bradford's going to have a tough time fending off Christian Haynes at that right guard spot, regardless of what the rotations have looked like in OTAs. Christian Haynes is going to be in the mix here when we get to training camp. He's going to get his opportunities to try to win that job, and Bradford's going to get his chances too. But Oluwatimi, to me, he has solidified his standing at center, so he would be my selection here, because he's going to start every game after starting just one last year. That's your hope, and that he's going to play well. Oluwatimi is a guy that could really be a building block for this offensive line moving forward. Really fun question here from DK_Wookie1 on X. Out of the 3 players here still available, which one would you see as bringing the most to the Seahawks? Justin Simmons, Connor Williams, Shaq Leonard. Can you see any of them coming out for a tryout? So I can tell you right now, Justin Simmons is not trying out for somebody. That is still a really good player. The reason he's out there is because he's expecting to make some money, and he should expect to make money. He's still a very good player, even if he's past 30 years old right now. I think the Seahawks are content with their safety position. If Justin Simmons was able to come in for near veteran minimum, then they would revisit that. I guarantee that. But that is not going to happen. He's going to get some money from somebody. Shaq Leonard would be the player of these three, just because we know the linebacker health situation. Jerome Baker may not be ready for the start of training camp. We don't know where he stands in his recovery, just that he's not going to be out there for minicamp. Tyrell Dodson's really done next to nothing to this point. He's got something going on injury-wise as well, and that is a position that looks like a barren wasteland in a lot of ways right now in terms of uncertainty. So Shaq Leonard, I think, would make the most sense just from the fact that they could use another veteran linebacker in there that has the all-pro pedigree. He's not the same player he was because he's had some injuries of his own, but that would be the one of the three players mentioned there. I don't think Connor Williams at this point with what Seattle's brought in, I don't think that he's going to move the needle coming off another ACL injury. So I don't see that being the move. Shaq Leonard would be the one of those three that would make the most sense. Our final question here coming from SL Wright 145 on X. If another team offered a first-round pick and additional compensation for DK Metcalf, would you consider making a deal? No, I wouldn't. And I've talked about this quite a bit on the show in recent episodes. The idea that the Seahawks would trade him at all right now, to me, seems pretty laughable. If they were going to move DK Metcalf, if that was something that they were considering doing, they would have found a way to do it before the draft so that they could have gotten extra picks, especially without a second-round selection. This is not something that the Seahawks are entertaining. That doesn't mean that teams haven't called. I could see teams calling. John Schneider's talked about this before. Just because they're calling, I'm going to answer the phone. That doesn't mean anything's going to come of it, though. And you look at Metcalf, he's only 26. He's still in the prime of his career. I just talked about Tyler Lockett's future potentially. If you're going to be losing Tyler Lockett in the next year, you don't want to be going into a situation where you lost both Metcalf and Lockett, and Jackson Smith-Njigba is the only receiver of those three that you have. So I don't see this happening. Much more likely Seattle is going to be opening that window for negotiation next year and trying to see that they can get another long-term contract signed with Metcalf. To me, that's more likely. If they can't get that done next year, then you can start talking about trades, because if there's not a contract agreement between the two sides, then Seattle may decide, look, let's go see if we can get something, maximize our value here, and then we'll try to see if we can get another young receiver to pair with Jackson Smith-Njigba. But I think right now at this stage, it would make absolutely no sense, and I would not be entertaining any deals for Metcalf right now with this football team. When I come back, going to be continuing to preview mandatory minicamp, looked at some storylines to watch on offense earlier. Let's swing over to the defensive side of the football. I'll be looking at several things that I'm going to be watching closely the next 3 days at the VMAG. When I return here, you are listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. You're listening to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s out there. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. The Seahawks will be finalizing their offseason program this week, the final step. 3-day mandatory minicamp. That means everybody's expected to be there. Maybe there's been some things agreed upon where a few veterans won't be out at the VMAC, or at least playing during the practice time there. There's going to be some guys coming back from injury. So not every single guy's going to be on the field, but this is the first offseason task that's going to be mandatory that veterans are expected to show up at. So these carry some weight, not as much as training camp, but still a very important 3 days, especially for young players. You got a new coaching staff that's continuing to break in their scheme. So there's a lot going on. On the defensive side of the football, speaking of that mandatory aspect, if there's been a position that has been a little bit light the last 3.5 weeks, it's been the defensive line. Now, Leonard Williams did show up for the last open OTA. He was in attendance. So he has been with the Seahawks at least for the past week and was able to participate at the end of OTAs. Jaron Reed participated in a few, but we didn't see any Draymond Jones. Cameron Young was nowhere to be found. So that's the first position group that I'm going to be watching, just from the standpoint I want to see how these rotations start to come together with a D-line that's got a lot of experience and yet a lot of youth as well. You've got Leonard Williams, Draymond Jones, who everyone's anticipating is going to be playing more off edge than what he did last year. And you've got Jaron Reed, you got the first-round pick, Byron Murphy II, Cameron Young, Jonathan Hankins, massive nose tackle coming in free agency. Mike Morris hoping to stand out coming off his shoulder injury that ended last year early for him. There are a lot of fun pieces on this defensive line, but I would really want to see, with everybody in attendance and everybody practicing, where does that rotation, where do these rotations start to come together? How much are we seeing Draymond Jones playing off the edge, standing up in a 2-point? How much is he playing inside? What do they do with Byron Murphy II? Do we see him start to slide out a little bit and play some big end in certain situations? I mean, there's a lot of intrigue with this position group. So these 3 days, I'm hoping we're going to see Draymond Jones out there, Leonard Williams, Jared Reed, all their key veterans, Byron Murphy II. Do we start to see how these rotations are going to come together, where guys are going to be playing alignment-wise? That is going to be something that I'm going to be watching very closely here in the next few days. Behind that defensive line, the linebacker position, and I do not say this lightly. This is just because you're talking no Bobby Wagner, no Jordan Brooks, Devin Bush left also. Tyrell Dodson, Jerome Baker have yet to practice this offseason. We'll see if Dodson's out there this week, but we know Baker isn't going to be based on updates from Mike Macdonald. This is a linebacker group right now that is being held together by duct tape and discount store super glue. You just don't have any experience out there on the field. The first team right now is John Radigan and Patrick O'Connell. They've been getting all the first team reps during OTAs. Less than 25 combined regular season defensive snaps between those two guys, who both were undrafted signings for the Seahawks. And they're solid special teams players, especially Radigan, but very little defensive experience. And then you've got two rookies behind them. Obviously, they've never played a down in the regular season in the NFL. 4th-round pick Tyrese Knight, as well as undrafted rookie Easton Gibbs. I want to see what this current situation is. One of these young guys really going to step up and rise the occasion with all these extra opportunities being afforded them? Maybe it's a Tyrese Knight, who I believe at some point, and it could be these next 3 days, we could see Mike Macdonald say, all right, he's got a chance to get his feet wet here in OTAs. Let's see where Tyrese Knight maybe can fit in playing some weak side linebacker with the first team defense. I could see that happening here in the next 3 days. Maybe somebody like an Easton Gibbs, who was extremely productive at Wyoming. Maybe you give him an opportunity to play a little bit with the ones, but Radigan and O'Connell have been the ones that have been getting all those reps right now. I just want to see which young linebackers can really rise up, or we can start seeing it again. These are non-padded practices, no contact. It's tough to evaluate. Yet at the same time, you're getting 3 straight days to really see where these guys are starting to fit in at linebacker. This position with very little to no experience right now that's out there on the field, at least healthy. I want to see which one of these young linebackers is going to be able to rise to the occasion and capitalize on all these reps, because, again, Radigan and O'Connell, they're getting tons of reps with the first team defense with this new scheme. And Tyrese Knight and Easton Gibbs, even if it's with a second team defense, they are getting the vast majority of those reps as well. So these guys are getting a lot of reps on the field. I want to see which players start to stand out a little bit. Are we going to see a player like a Knight play some with the first team defense here without Dodson and Baker being available? That is what I'm curious watching the next few days, because that to me right now is still the biggest question mark in this entire roster at this stage. And speaking of competitions, a little bit different perspective here. Linebacker, the concern is who is going to step up. There's no experience. When you look at the Seahawks secondary, it's polar opposite here. You have Reek Woolen and Devin Witherspoon that are going to be starting for you at the cornerback position. But you got to figure out who's going to be the other outside corner, presuming that Devin Witherspoon is going to play a lot of those snaps when they're in nickel and dime in the slot, where he has excelled so much since coming into the league. Is it going to be Trey Brown? Is it going to be Mike Jackson? So at this point, at least the 2 OTAs that I was at, Trey Brown was getting those reps with the first team defense at the other boundary corner position. But we talked earlier about Mike Jackson's experience, what he brings to the table, a lot of starts under his belt. He is going to be part of this. Maybe a 5th-round pick like Nehemiah Pritchett with his 4.3 speed. If he's able to make some good impressions here, maybe he throws his hat in the ring. And that even delves down to the backup slot position. Artie Burns got his first action last year as a slot. Kobe Bryant is still on the roster. DJ James, your other Auburn corner that you picked in the 6th round, it sounds like they're planning to play him inside. That's going to be his first opportunity. So that is really competitive when you're looking at guys that could play in 5 and 6 defensive back situations, depending on the package that you're in. So there's quite a bit of competition there, even if it isn't for the top 2 spots. And the same thing goes at the safety position as well. Rayshon Jenkins and Julian Love, those are going to be your 2 starters. Kayvon Wallace was brought in as a free agent on a 1-year deal, but he isn't going to be just given that big nickel role. There's going to be competition. Now, Jarek Reed II not being active yet, coming off a torn ACL. that takes one of the main contenders out. If he was healthy, I would expect he very much is in the mix to get some playing time as a third safety. Mike Macdonald is going to run quite a bit of 3 safety sets. He did in Baltimore. I expect that to carry over as a head coach in Seattle. But Kayvon Wallace going up against Kobe Bryant, that looks to be the battle that we're seeing now. At this stage, I think that's Kobe Bryant's best chance to stick on this football team because the corner position is so crowded now. And even at the slot position, I don't know that he stacks up with the players they have brought in terms of his changing direction skills and stuff, playing that particular position. They've got so many good players. The outside corner spot, safety might be his best bet with that corner background, being that third safety that you can move around in dime packages. That might be his best chance right now. So Kobe Bryant, Kayvon Wallace, maybe Ty Okada and Jonathan Sutherland being in the mix there too. 2 guys that this new staff that have inherited that they seem to be pretty high on as well. So you've got some depth there. You've got some talent, and they're going to be vying for those situational snaps when you're in dime or even the bandit packages. If you got 7 defensive backs in the field, you might have an extra corner and 2 extra safeties, or 2 corners and 1 extra safety. This is going to be a position group in general, a secondary, where kind of like the receiver on offense, you know who your starters are going to be for the most part, but you need to figure out who those situational guys and the reserves are going to be that you can use in sub packages. And there's some really intriguing names there. If you get Jarek Reed, the second back, healthy in training camp, he can be part of this as well. But even without him, these mandatory minicamp practices, I want to see what that rotation looks like, how they're mixing in players, different packages, who's getting reps to the first team, where does Kobe Bryant specifically fit in what the Seahawks are doing. They're working diligently trying to figure out the best spot for him. Again, I think it is the safety position just based on depth. That to me is his best chance to be able to stick on this roster. Corner is going to be extremely challenging. So this is a tightly contested positional group, both corner and safety, when you're looking from a depth standpoint and some of these situational roles. And I think these next 3 days, you might get some indicators on who is holding the edge heading towards training camp. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to follow Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, I'll be joined by Rob Rang at the VMAC after the first mandatory minicamp practice. We'll have some takeaways, observations coming out of the VMAC, and much more. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.